Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special council meeting of the City of Casey on the 30th of August. I'd like to welcome those in the gallery and also officers present. And I'll start with introductions. My panel colleagues, Mr Miguel Belmar.
Good afternoon, Chair.
And Mr Cameron Boardman.
Good afternoon, Chair.
And my name's Nolene Duff, Chair of Administrators. And we're joined by a number of officers this afternoon, notably our Chief Executive Officer, Mr Glenn Patterson, and we have a number of senior officers here present with us, starting with Jen Bednar, Director Customer and Business Transformation, Mr Steve Coldham, Director Corporate Services, Ms Colette McMahon, Director Community Life, and James Collins, Director City Planning and Infrastructure. We're assisted this afternoon by Matthew Crane in AV and Sharon Lozen in Governance Support, and we have a number of other officers present as well. So welcome to everybody. I'd like to open the meeting with the statement of acknowledgement. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities, and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. Item 1.2, the diversity statement. The City of Casey is home to remarkable diversity with many cultures, languages, faiths and communities of worship, ages, LGBTQI+ identities and landscapes, together forming our rich and dynamic community story. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. Item 2, Declaration of Interests. I've considered my obligations under Section 130 of the Local Government Act and do not have any conflicts to declare relevant to today's agenda papers. Do any council officers or my colleague administrators have any conflicts to declare?
I have no conflicts to declare, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Boardman.
I likewise have no conflicts.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Item 3 is public question time, and we note that there were no questions raised for today's meeting. The substance of the meeting today is one officer report, and that's item 4.1, the adoption of the governance rules. And I do note, as my colleagues will comment on during the meeting, that this is specifically this afternoon, the resolution is to allow for the council to continue, where it's appropriate and relevant, virtual representation of panel members, should that be required, to ensure that the business of the council can continue. But I'll leave it to my colleagues to move and second and speak to item 4.1. Do I have a mover?
Chair, I'll move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. And a seconder?
Yes, I'll second it.
Mr Belmar? Mr Boardman?
Chair, thank you for your introductory comments and noting that there is a degree of urgency with the recommendations in 4 parts, predominantly that we have an obligation under the Act to adopt the governance rules by this Friday, the 2nd of September, which will allow for the continuation of virtual meeting provisions, which is not just an initiative that has been associated with the recent changes to meeting procedures across all aspects of government as a consequence of the pandemic, but it is a process which brings meeting procedures at this council and other municipalities into a very common set of practices, one where I personally, Chair, have been made available, or I've availed myself, I should say, of such process by being either interstate or otherwise unable to attend a meeting in person, and it is a common sense approach to do that. But specifically, we have exhibited the governance rules for a period of 4 weeks. We've received 4 written submissions and a number of other points from those submitters, which I'll touch on in just a moment. But we have scheduled this afternoon's special council meeting to deal with those submissions and to adopt the governance rules in conjunction with the timings that I have articulated. We also want to resolve, as point 4, as viewers can see on their screens, a revised draft to be considered by the Council in November 2022 to incorporate further changes in response to the community feedback, and a following round of consultation will be undertaken at that stage. So this is not the end of the process. It is an important part of the process to ensure that we adopt the governance rules consistent with our requirements under the Act, and to ensure that we can continue to operate in a modern environment. But we will be undertaking further consultation once we respond to the submitters and a number of the valid points that have been raised. I just want to just very briefly, if I could please, Chair, outline what is in the governance rules, which is quite important in response to the submission that we have received. There are a number of major components, which include the conduct of council meetings, the conduct of delegated committee meetings, the form and availability of records, the election period policy in accordance with Section 69 of the 2020 Act, the procedures for disclosure of a conflict of interest by a councillor or a member of a delegated committee or a member of council staff when providing information in respect of a matter within the meaning of Section 126 of the Act, and any other matter prescribed by the Local Government Governance and Integrity regulations of 2020. But if I go through the governance rules, I do have one particular section which I think is probably the most important section within the governance rules, which is something that I would encourage any aspiring candidate that may be seeking election to this council or any other council for that matter in late 2024. And that is clause 2.4, and it states as verbatim, councillors cannot direct or improperly influence or attempt to direct or improperly influence the functions, duties, actions, recommendations or advice provided by council officers. Improper direction and improper influence are covered under Section 124 of the Act. And whilst the governance rules articulates meeting procedures, the process for dealing with any points of order around the interpretation of the governance rules and the process for dealing with motions, it also very importantly articulates the roles and responsibilities and the expectations of the mayor and councillors in such formats. And Chair, it's a common fact, and it's something that we have said quite often and with necessary duplication from our perspective, that the governance rules and the way that we conduct ourselves in these environments not only reflect clause 2.4, but the suite of governance documents which are informing and underpinning all of our activities, and we do very much take a professional and best practice approach. But the reason I highlight that particular clause, Chair, is we do understand what has been raised in public hearings in Operation Stand, that some stage that the evidence suggested that perhaps clause 2.4 was perhaps not something that was necessarily abided to as much as it should have been, and that is only something that has been raised in the public evidence. I'm not drawing any conclusions or making any statements further to that, but it is an important aspect of a professional, a well-functioning and a properly governed organisation in the future, that every aspiring candidate and councillor for that matter does take heed of the roles and responsibilities and the conduct provisions within these governance rules. If I could just make some further comments, Chair, before I talk about the submissions and perhaps invite commentary from my colleague Mr Belmar. If I do compare these governance rules to the parliamentary standing orders, for example, they are very prescriptive, they are very procedurally based. My personal view is that whilst it is necessary to have that degree of articulation of the detail contained within them, it does raise the question as to what is the appropriate level of information and procedural requirements to ensure a properly functioning organisation and properly functioning procedures at council meetings. It is perhaps something that, from a state government perspective and from a wider municipal basis, that there could be some streamlining of these rules, particularly with the emphasis on the professionalism and the conduct and the responsibilities of individuals that will be abiding by these rules now and into the future. But in comparison with the voluminous nature of these governance rules, in comparison with the Parliament of Victorian standing orders and other similar standing orders of parliaments around the country, they are very complicated and very prescriptive. And whilst that is understandable in some circumstances, it perhaps is not by itself lending itself to a best practice environment, but that is a matter that I'm sure that will be dealt with by authorities much more informed and qualified than I am. Chair, just briefly in conclusion, we do note, and I said this in my opening comments, that a number of the issues raised by the submitters, particularly around formatting and having systems to deal with electronic petitions, looking at aspects around the potential misinterpretation of some of the specific rules, specifically relating to when motions are rejected, looking at the aspects around notice periods for motions to be submitted, and also the availability of the public to attend meetings and to provide an opportunity for public questions. We do acknowledge that that feedback has been provided to us. Council officers are in the process of detailing responses to that and ensuring that we do meet community expectations in a reasonable, professional and consistent manner. And as I said, we'll be making further comment at our November 2022 meeting and allowing for a further provision of public exhibition to seek further clarification and feedback from concerned community members accordingly. But with those comments, Chair, we acknowledge that this is an important part of the suite of governance documents and the framework that we undertake as an organisation to ensure we meet our statutory and community expectations. We do have that timeliness and urgency around it, considering that the 2nd of September is rapidly approaching. We also undertake to respond to the community on some of the valid points that have been raised and ensure that we do have subsequent exhibition into the future. And with those comments, Chair, I move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on the comments by Mr Boardman, I've also considered the papers and thank those members of the community who have downloaded and read the papers. Sometimes meeting procedure documents aren't exactly the most exciting documents, but they are important because they are fundamental to good governance. In particular, I want to address what is really the part of the papers that the governance rules that we're dealing with tonight. We're dealing with all of them, but in particular, I want to note clause 35 and attendance by electronic means, and note that it is it provides for a very flexible participation in meetings. It ensures that members of council and future councillors are able to arrange their affairs in a way which means that they can attend, and if by chance they need to make arrangements at short notice, the rules provide that can be done even on the day. So these are very flexible rules, but at the same time I am also mindful of the fact that the rules also provide that it is the councillor who wants to attend by electronic means who has responsibility for ensuring that they can do so. And again, it's important to understand that being able to attend by electronic means should not become the ordinary course, and it'll always be, from my point of view, the best to do it in a public setting in the council chambers. If I can just reflect for a moment on my experience over the last 2 years, both in this chamber with respect to electronic meetings, they absolutely work. And secondly, if I can also reflect on the very formal procedure of court hearings in the state in which I've been able to participate, which have occurred electronically. And again, the community has been able to adapt. It's been able to work with this new procedure, and there's no reason why going into the future, in appropriate circumstances and with appropriate notice, that electronic meetings are able to occur. With those comments, Chair, I'm happy to second the motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. I'd just like to make a few comments, and one of those really relates back to comments that Mr Boardman made about the extensive and detailed nature of the governance rules before us this afternoon. During the consultation process for the Local Government Act 2020 and considering the governance arrangements to be adopted by councils, there was some considerable consideration and debate about having consistency across the state of governance rules. So, in other words, one set of governance rules for the 79 councils, which seemed to me to make a lot of good sense, most particularly because residents in communities journalists, observers of council have to negotiate their way through the various procedures across 79 councils. So it seemed to me to make some good sense that there was an argument for consistency across the state, but that wasn't considered in the Local Government Act as it was finally adopted. So here we are with extensive and detailed procedures, and every council in Victoria determining with respect to the processes that sit around virtual meetings now as well, which seems to me to be potentially a lot of effort by a lot of people to come to some fairly similar conclusions. However, with that, I will put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you, panel members, and that is the single and only item for this afternoon's meeting. So I thank everybody for their participation, those in the gallery watching online, and conclude the meeting with good afternoon. Thank you, everyone.